Welcome to MedEvidence, where we help you navigate the truth behind medical research with unbiased, evidence-proven facts. Hosted by cardiologist and top medical researcher, Dr. Michael Koren.
Hello, I'm Dr. Michael Koren, the executive editor of MedEvidence. And one of the really fun parts of my job is I get to catch up with old friends and talk about their lives, and gives me an opportunity to talk a little bit about my life, but more interestingly, the guests' lives and how we have interfaced over time. And I had that great opportunity today to interview my friend and colleague, Dr. Evan Loh. And Evan and I caught up at a recent Harvard Medical School reunion, and when I was learning about what he was doing with his career, I was really, frankly, blown away. And I said, Evan, you got to come to MedEvidence and tell us about your journey from when I knew you back as a medical student to becoming an academic cardiologist to now running a drug company. So, Evan, welcome to MedEvidence, and share with us this incredible journey.
Yeah. Hey, Michael. This is such a treat for me to be here with you. I'm delighted that we've had each other in our lives over these many, many years. It's hard to even imagine the actual number of years since we actually were in medical school together.
Yeah, that's a classified secret, my friend.
It is. I was not going to reveal that. So a little bit of background on me for the audience. I am the firstborn son of Chinese immigrants who came here to the United States in 1955, neither of them speaking English, having to relearn English and relearn their medicine. My father was a physician and my mom was a nurse, and trying to figure out how to make a world for themselves here in the United States. They didn't have family to go back to at that time. There was a lot going on back there in Asia at the time. And, as being the firstborn son in a traditional Chinese household that we tried to make, there was a big emphasis on trying to figure out, what was going to be the career path for this child. And I did a lot of things. I enjoyed every kind of sport possible. I was the shortstop of my Little League baseball team, and I also played the violin, and I was quite good at it. And
you were incredible. Just an aside for the audience, we had a big show when we were second-year medical students, and Evan actually opened the show playing the violin from Fiddler on the Roof that we turned into a bit of a comedy sketch, and was more than just good. He maybe not quite a virtuoso, but pretty darn close.
Well, you're awfully kind, Michael. It was something that I enjoyed then and continue to play today in terms of enjoying it, chamber music and what have you. But my mother quickly said, "You can't have a career as a musician."
Really?
That was not okay.
Okay.
So, and the small world that I lived in, I grew up in New Haven, and all of the men and women that we had in our Chinese student circles, they were all either MDs or PhDs. So there was a little bit of predestination in the sense that my world was very narrow, Michael. So I think that on some level, medicine was preordained, or some pathway within the medical research field from that perspective. So as I finished college and applied to medical school, decided that was the path that I ultimately wanted to take. I think that the pathway deviated a little bit from what my parents knew, because my parents really, when they came here, needed to basically get certified to practice medicine. And that was really their goal, to have a career, to have a job, and to be able to put a roof over our heads and support our education. But where I deviated a little bit was the fact that I really, by being at Harvard and searching out opportunities to actually open my mind up, got involved with ongoing medical research. And so I did a senior thesis. I did it at the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute. We worked on fundamental pathways of metabolism in oncologic cells, and we had the chance to get those data published. But I got exposed to the fact that there's a real opportunity to put translational data that you generate in cell systems, even in mice systems or other animal systems, and apply them to ask the question, are they relevant for human disease, and asking that particular question. And so that was the background upon which I went into medical school. And, when Michael and I first met there, I don't know whether you remember this, Michael, but we had a research mentor program for all first-year HMS students.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you mentioned maybe Harvey Feinberg was someone that was close to you, but
Yeah.
Tom Smith, who is the chief of cardiology at the Brigham,
Oh, wow. Okay.
was my first-year mentor.
Very cool.
And so he brought me down into the basement of the Brigham, the new Brigham, showed me his DIG antibody machine that he had, the only person in the world that could actually get DIG antibodies and monitor DIG levels in the world.
Right.
And
for everybody, digoxin is a drug that we've used in cardiology for hundreds of years, literally.
For decades, yeah.
It was changing when we were in school, but prior to that, people would never know if you were toxic from DIG or actually benefiting from it.
That's right.
And this will get into our evidence-based medicine discussion, but we didn't even know the evidence for digoxin until relatively recently. But sorry for
that's right. That's right. And it's been controversial, actually, interestingly.
Yeah. Sorry to interrupt, but a little aside.
But then it turns out that HMS had a program in the summertime.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you remember this. You could apply as a student to actually do a medical research project, and they would pay you. Guess how much they paid me? $1,500 for 12 weeks of work.
Nice.
And it turns out that I did a research project in one of Tom Smith's cardiology labs.
Mm-hmm.
And it was with Jim Marsh. And we did work on understanding calcium channel receptor physiology.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was my start of my exposure to cardiology and learning about that. And it's kind of stuck with me, Michael. And so that's ultimately why I ended up going into cardiology from that standpoint. So you and I graduated. I got my house staff training at the Brigham Internal Medicine, did my cardiology there, and got a transplant fellowship as certification there at the Brigham, spent a few years there, and ultimately went to the University of Pennsylvania, where they asked me to run their cardiac transplantation program, which I did for about 7 years or so. And we were able to grow that program to, I think, the 5th largest volume heart transplantation program in the country.
Wow.
And had a lot of fun doing that, built a giant program, a lot of fun. And, it was at a point where academic medicine, this was back in 2000 or so. This is when academic medicine, had begun to have its struggles with understanding, how to actually run medical centers. They were trying to consolidate primary care practices, et cetera. And I think the margins in those businesses were hard. And they really, even though I had a translational program where I was the clinical director and I had to liaise with people that had labs, that was not the commodity that they valued, Michael. They really valued my RVUs. They wanted me to be busier. And that's what they valued at that time.
Yeah. So for the audience, RVUs are relative value units, and that doctors get paid in a lot of settings based on how many visits they do or how many procedures they do based on this RVU matrix. But
yeah. And so, even though we had fellows and lots of research going, I'd published, 100 plus papers, written a book, et cetera. That was not really what they valued, which was disappointing to me. And I wanted to actually ask myself, where else could I go to actually think about being in that translational space where I could apply interesting basic science knowledge translated into animal models and ultimately think about how it could continue to be a positive outcome for improving and advancing clinical care. Because I'd done some of that work, when I was a cardiologist. You read some of my papers in terms of being the first person to publish the beneficial effects of warfarin in patients with heart failure, secondary to myocardial infarction, and other things along those lines. So it turned out that I made a big transition. I left academic medicine and I joined a large pharmaceutical company called Wyeth. Stayed there for about 9 years, developed a bunch of different medicines, and then we were acquired by Pfizer. And after being there for a couple of years, I really wanted to get out and go on my own, and wanted to get back to drug development. And ultimately landed here at my company called Paratech. This is back about 13 years ago, and we've been able to get the company public after being private, and then now we're private again, but raised a ton of capital, probably about $1.5 billion worth of capital.
Wow.
In about 12 years to get to the point where we actually have 2 approved products in our portfolio, and we are commercially out in the marketplace with our two two drugs. One is an broad spectrum next generation tetracycline, and then the other product is a new med device combination with a next generation Flonase for people with chronic sinusitis with and without nasal polyps. And so we're moving along and we're having a good time, but it's, one of those places where, as I harken back to something that I learned when I transitioned into pharma, we had, I was a thought leader, Michael, had published a lot of papers, and, there's academicians who think they're really important. And I get into the pharmaceutical world, and my head of clinical research and development at Wyatt sat me down and said, look, I just want to let you know, and this is what I've seen before in the past. He said, when academics come into pharmaceutical land, they think they're really important.
Right.
But at the end of the day, no one really cares.
Right.
All they care about is that you're focused on doing great drug development and helping them be successful. And that was really a sobering moment for me. It was kind of humbling in some sense, because I didn't really understand how drug development has to work, which is in a team setting. One of the things that I like to say in my company is that no one in my company has a monopoly on intelligence. And you need to bring ideas from everybody in order to have successful drug development, because people come from different places. They have different levels of experience.
Right.
And, when another theme that I had that I learned that I still think about today is that the head of our commercial business also said, you guys here can really spend a lot of time thinking about transformational changes, making the company more efficient, thinking about doing it with less heads, blah, 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 blah. But you know what? There are no great pharmaceutical companies on this planet. There are only companies that have great products. Focus on the great products. And that was really a theme that I continue to believe in today. That's really, really important. And what are those great products, Michael? I know that you're in this field. You've been in this field for decades, leading clinical trial development, clinical trial protocol development, living in the regulatory world. At the end of the day, it's a mix, right? One is that it has to make a difference in a patient's life in a way that's really objective, demonstrable, measurable, that a regulator can say yes to. But at the end of the day, it's got to be something that a doctor is going to care about. Yeah. And then finally, I think the other piece that I think pharmaceutical companies can sometimes lose their way, and it speaks to the value of, I think, being a physician in this particular field, is just always respecting and honoring a prima facie commitment to patient safety. No doubt. Always, because you're asking them to take a potential drug or an antibody or a vaccine that could ultimately hurt them. And you and I know that the last thing that we want to ever have at the patient's bedside is that we do something or make a recommendation that the outcome is less than perfect. And I know nature and medicine are humbling every day. We do our best based upon the information we have, but we don't want to actively participate with a company or a product that ultimately has a higher risk of actually hurting someone than making them better.
Yeah, you said so many incredible things in that little discussion, and a lot of stuff to unpack. So I'm going to, in no particular order, one of the things that you said that resonated with me was this trade-off between the clinical care and the RVU environment, where you're being valued based on what you do for one patient at a time, which is important, versus research, which impacts thousands of people at a time. And it reminds me of a discussion I had with my cardiology fellowship mentor, Dick Devereaux. I don't know if you ever worked with Dick, but he was my mentor at Cornell during cardiology fellowship. And he kind of drove that idea into my head in a big way. He said, clinical care is important, but let's face it, you're affecting one person at a time. Whereas in the research world, you're literally affecting thousands or millions of people based on the work you're doing. And that always really resonated with me. And I think you have that DNA as well. And interestingly, you kind of made the path to industry in part to pursue that DNA, if you will.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think you hit it right on the head. People have asked me, you had such a great career in academia and in cardiology. Why'd you leave? I said, well, in some regards, it was unbelievable in terms of my experience, just like yours, when you were actively, and you may still be seeing patients, I think, one day a week, to make that difference one patient at a time. I think, though, where the where the rubber met the road for me is that I was getting pulled so heavily into the clinical arena that I couldn't actually have the time to think about fundamental research questions that would advance the field and make patients' lives better. And I hoped when I moved into the pharma world that, number one, the science was good, and number two, that they were asking good fundamental questions that could advance the care of patients. And I think that's part of the subtlety, Michael, that folks don't really appreciate. The science in the pharmaceutical research world, in the biotech world, is top shelf.
Yeah, no doubt.
It's really top shelf with
No
top
doubt.
shelf scientists, top shelf researchers. I mean, you can't really go in to clinical trials and give patients these medicines unless you've really understood the products. And I've learned so much that I'd never learned in medical school, which is pharmacokinetics, pharmacodynamics, drug metabolism, conversions. I had to go back to my Krebs cycles. I had to go back to my, all of it's relevant.
No doubt.
And,
Absolutely.
And
it's fun to use that stuff. Yeah, it's fun to say, "Oh, I did study this when I was a first-year medical student, and now I see the relevance after all these years." Yeah, so that is fun. So I want to also focus on something else you said that I think is really compelling, which is the role of the physician in drug development and how there's a centricity around the patient and safety when we do what we do that's probably fundamentally different than non-physician researchers. So maybe you can comment a little bit more on that.
Yeah, if you think about the predominant percentage of people that are in pharmaceutical drug development, I would say 98% of them are actually non-physicians. And if you look at the leadership of these organizations, because they have to survive, right? And they have to be, profitable, most of the senior leaders are actually commercially driven or from the finance world. And so they've never been at the bedside. And I do think that there's also some bias that clinicians in the pharmaceutical drug development world are really only good for safety, to evaluate patient safety, which is great. They understand that there's no one else that can actually do that because they've not been at the bedside. But I think where that assumption goes awry, Michael, and you and I were talking about this earlier, is that I don't think that anyone else has really been at the bedside to understand how a clinician thinks, how they might use a new medicine, what their determinants of what a good outcome would be for a patient with disease X or Y. And I think that's where I think physicians that have the ability to navigate through the complexities of the science, the translation, the clinical development data, as well as on the commercial side and marketing side, to be able to blend those together, I think physicians have an incredibly important role because we're the only ones that have ever been at the bedside. And I think that one of the pieces of feedback that I get very consistently that I'm very pleased about in my current company, by being a physician who's the CEO, I talk about patients every time I talk publicly with my company. The patients are always front and center. Patient safety always is number one, Michael. I know you believe in that in terms of everything that we do. But the products that we ultimately have, I ask all of my employees at the end of the day, if it's your mother, father, brother, sister, grandmother, grandfather, would this actually be a product that you would feel comfortable giving to your mother, father, brother, sister, grandmother, grandfather?
I love that.
So it is about patient safety. And so by doing that, everyone in the company comes up to me and they say, wow, it's so great to have a physician leading this company because I understand who are we fighting for? We are fighting for our patients. And that's really the theme that I like to carry through in my current leadership role. And I don't think it's any different, Michael, than why I went to medical school, which is kind of odd because, I'm not actually at the bedside, but patients are front and center because they have to be. Otherwise,
absolutely.
Otherwise, the mission is actually off point.
Yeah, well said. So that gets me to sort of the last point I wanted to drill down with you on, which is this concept of what is evidence-based medicine, and particularly how patients could fit into that. And as you know, we've had this discussion previously, but kind of my career path has been around not only looking at the outcomes of the studies that we do, but also thinking about what that experience was for all these patients and why that's such a fulfilling experience and a valuable experience for patients. And of course, I built an organization around that to give patients the opportunity to have those experiences. But I think there's a lot of misconceptions about what evidence-based medicine is, first of all, and then secondly, why it's so attractive for patients, for people to get involved in this process. So maybe share some of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, look, I think that if you look at the history of clinical research, right, you can go back to the Tuskegee experiments and other things that, have given it a bad name. And I think that things have really come a long ways. If you look at the Declaration of Helsinki and the International Committee on Harmonization of Clinical Trial Development, or ICH, there are fundamental oversight bodies that we ascribe to, we commit to, and that we live by to ensure that patients, when they're asked to participate, there's no coercion, that they're actually in a place where the experience is actually should be in some ways no different than getting routine clinical care, and that in fact we try to minimize the amount of abuse in terms of blood draws or other procedures, sure, or other x-rays or other things.
Data collection. We won't call it abuse. We'll call it data collection.
Yeah, I think abuse is not the right word, but thank you for that. But I think it's really the amount of data collection.
Right.
And I think that there's also a moral contract that you develop with these patients or even normal volunteers who participate in pharmacokinetic studies to ask them to actually participate. Is that I think that what I think you've experienced as well as I've experienced is that there is a deep-seated level of altruism, mm-hmm, totally, that humans absolutely actually have. Yeah. That they say, you know what, it may not be good for me, but if this is data that you say could lead to this improvement or this new medicine helping this cohort of individuals down the road, I'm all in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'm all in to help you.
Yeah.
And I just continue to just tip my hat to all of those patients who say yes. And when they say yes, I also say to my folks that are working on my side, remember what they've said yes to. And we have an absolute obligation to transparency, to treat them well, to let them be able to say that I'm done, I don't want to participate anymore, to give them complete freedom to, determine their pathway. And at the end of the day, interact with their physicians in a way that at the right time, they can also share the outcomes of the trial with them so that they know what they participated in. So I think that there's a full circle here, Michael, as you said, absolutely, in terms of their participation to generate these data.
Yeah.
But in the absence of these data, we don't get life-saving cancer drugs. We don't get life-saving cardiovascular drugs. We don't get life-saving drugs that, change the natural history of people with rheumatoid arthritis. You remember the days when we were at the Brigham where these elderly patients would come in wheelchairs with deformed joints, their hands, their legs, they couldn't walk. Today, medical students don't see that type of rheumatoid arthritis.
Yeah, so interesting.
And it's right? Yeah. And it's because of the proteins that we've developed, the Enbrels and the Humiras and things like that. The disease has completely changed. Mm-hmm. I mean, and I just am so excited to be part of this industry. I mean, think about the natural history of cystic fibrosis, right? They used to all perish, in their late teens. Today, the natural history of patients with cystic fibrosis, because of the interventions and the places that these new drugs have gone, 64 years, Michael, is the life expectancy of a patient with cystic fibrosis.
Amazing.
5 more decades of life. I mean, that's amazing, right?
It's absolutely fabulous. It's absolutely fabulous. And so, we used to compare notes all the time at the different cardiology meetings when you were running the heart failure program at Penn. I remember we had some discussions, and obviously you were getting people in clinical trials that were really, really sick. And in that case, a lot of the people are really doing it to see if they can improve their survival. But there's so many other elements of participation that people love. And my favorite statistic to quote is when you ask an average American or average European who's never been exposed to clinical research whether or not they're interested in being involved in a clinical trial, only 40% say yes.
Oh.
But if you ask somebody that's completed a research study, if you would do a second study, 97 to 99% of people say yes. And the reason that there's that high conversion rate to being true believers and fans in the process is because they get so many things. They get the socialization, the intense interaction with the staff and the physicians, which, as you alluded to, is not really part of clinical medicine nowadays. Everything has become sort of cookbook and just processing. And the human touch has been unfortunately extracted a lot from clinical medicine, but you still get that in research, ironically, when you think about it. And of course, there's a lot of information that's shared with the patients. People get imaging tests that they might not get. People get treatments that they may or may not get, although we're always very clear that sometimes we don't know what you're on, and sometimes it can be a placebo. But And there's also stipends. People, in many cases, get paid for their time and travel. That is helpful for a lot of people. It could be the difference between not a great Christmas and having more money for gifts for the family. So, these are practical things that really impacted a lot of our patients. But you brought up the thing that I think is the most compelling, which is at the end of the day, we get these results that change the world. Yeah. And people love that. And it could change the world for that generic person out there, or it can change the world for a family member because it's a genetic disease that we're learning about. And so to me, this is what floats my boat. This is what gets me excited. And this is the experiential part of evidence-based medicine. And then there's one other part that I don't think people understand that well, and I'd love to hear your comments on that, which is, and we kind of alluded to it in some of our stories, but 50 years ago, the way physicians worked was kind of, okay, well, my friend, the oncologist tried this, and maybe we'll try it, versus what we do now, which is when we actually use a medicine that's been approved, we know a lot about it. And we talked about digoxin, which is probably the oldest cardiac drug. Aspirin may have been the oldest cardiac drug. We didn't even know it was a cardiac drug for many years.
No, that's right.
But digoxin has been something that's been used by physicians for over 200 years. And it was only in the last 20 years or so where we actually had a study to show that it kind of worked, but maybe not as much as we thought. So this whole concept of just assuming that the physician has all this information versus actually having the information is a fundamental transformative part of evidence-based medicine. But your reaction to that?
I think it's spot on. It is. I think when you look at evidence-based medicine, Michael, I think you can take it to one extreme, which is that if you don't have the evidence, you can't use it. However, I think that there is a gradient of data that actually you can couple together with your bedside experiences to ultimately have you decide what's best at the end of the day. I think that, where things have gone a little sideways recently is not really understanding or appreciating how hard it is to generate those studies. And when you look at the analytics that go along with it, how important they are to, I think, being able to answer a fundamental clinical question. And number two, I think, how does it ultimately get applied in the clinical care? Because, as you know, sometimes these clinical trials are designed in ways where you have to try to get as pure a population as possible to be able to have that intervention be the one thing that you could actually determine was making the difference, as opposed to putting it in the context of a clinical care algorithm where you actually may have other drugs in the mix at the time, but the regulators and also clinicians want to see the effect of that one drug as opposed to that in combination. Those data come later, but it's one of those things where I think it really is very helpful. And I think when you go back to our training and you think about some of the trials that we looked at, right, such as the natural history of untreated aortic stenosis, from Gene Brownwall, or, the outcome of low gradient aortic stenosis and LV dysfunction, right? That Blaise Carabello study was done in like 20 patients. I mean, that's what we based our practice on, what was published, right? Yeah. I mean, it was the best we had at that time. But now you're talking about trials that have tens of thousands of patients of data, like you said. We really do know that these drugs, number one, are fundamentally safe, or they have, a risk of diarrhea or nausea or what have you. But at the end of the day, we can actually be able to in a very, very accurate way, tell the clinician exactly what they could potentially expect on a population basis for the effect size.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you brought up something that's interesting is, again, it's the balance between some of the clinical aspects and the scientific aspects. And all the things that we do in evidence-based medicine is built on these protocols. But it doesn't take away our commitment to the patients and doing the right thing for the patient. I'll give you a recent example of that. So, as you know, I've done a lot of work in the lipid world, and we've done a lot of early phase clinical trials here in Jacksonville. And we had a patient last year who was in for a very early phase lipid study, which involved confinement for 7 days here in our offices. And very nice guy. Probably not somebody that was interacting with the standard medical profession as much as he should, had multiple cardiovascular risk factors, but actually known actual heart disease. And he's in a lipid study, and he starts to get a little angina when he's here with us, okay? And because of the fact that we're, even though we have a protocol that doesn't really evaluate angina, of course, for the safety of the patient, we do what's necessary. And then we find he has a little troponin bump, which means that he had some damage to his heart muscle. And so literally we got him from our confinement area to the cath lab, which is, of course, not part of the protocol at all, but this is what we need to do for the patient. And he had a very serious obstruction of his coronary artery that we fixed.
Wow,
and so he comes back after that, and I didn't know how he was going to react to the whole thing. Would he blame the study for this whole thing? And Evan, he was so thankful. He literally thanked me for saving his life, because he said, I understand that if it wasn't for this study, I would not have had that experience. And even though I did end up having a small heart attack, it turns out you would have never known this problem, and you literally saved my life. And so it's an example of in the process of creating evidence-based medicine for a new lipid drug, we actually had a huge impact on somebody's life. And again, this is, to me, why it's so important what we do. And you've touched this space in so many places during your career, from being a medical student and drawing blood on people to running a heart failure clinic, and now actually running a drug company that finds the funds and finds the logistics to actually run these studies across the world. So again, congratulations and thanks for everything that you do.
Look, Michael, thanks for that. I love that story. And, at the end of the day, and I know you care deeply about evidence-based medicines, but, what I like to say, is that at the end of the day, data is forgotten, but stories are remembered. And what are we in the business of? We're in the business of generating great patient stories. And that through line has not changed a whit from our time in medical school to today. And I'm just honored and privileged to have been part of this industry and making a difference in patients' lives each and every day.
Well, that was a brilliant way to end our discussion, and I want to thank you for being part of MedEvidence, and thank you for spending some time with us. And this has been a true pleasure for me. Thank you, Evan.
Tons of fun, Michael. Thank you so much.
Thanks for joining the MedEvidence podcast. To learn more, head over to MedEvidence.com or subscribe to our podcast on your favorite podcast platform.